Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Yusuf Aram. In Istanbul, diplomacy is being put to the test once again. As the war in Ukraine drags into its third brutal summer, Turkish officials quietly hosted a new round of high-stakes negotiations on Wednesday. Ceasefire proposals were floated even as Russian forces continued to push into Ukraine's northeast. And in a rare moment of progress, Russia and Ukraine completed a new prisoner exchange, the latest under the Istanbul-brokered framework. Hundreds of detainees were freed on both sides after the talks. Behind closed doors, Turkish mediators are navigating narrow paths towards de-escalation. Ceasefire talks remain fragile with no public commitments, but the return of prisoners has injected fresh urgency into diplomacy. Meanwhile, a parallel track of nuclear negotiations with Iran has resumed in Istanbul. Western envoys are urging Tehran to halt uranium enrichment as the region deals with the fallout from last month's Israeli and U.S. airstrikes on Iran's nuclear sites. Turkey isn't just hosting these talks, it's driving them. With its NATO leverage, enduring ties to Moscow, and decades of engagement with Tehran, Turkey is pushing for diplomacy even as much of the world hardens into opposing camps. For more, joining me now from London is Keir Giles. He's a political analyst and author. Also from London, Council of Arab-British Understanding Director Chris Doyle, and from Ankara, Shuay Nilhan Açıkalın, an associate professor at Ankara Hacı Bayram Veli University. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining me. Keir, Ukraine talks back on. How significant is that these talks are even happening?
Well, there will never be peace without some kind of conversation leading towards peace. But of course, that doesn't mean that these talks are necessarily going to generate any forward movement. There's been no change in the basic positions of the two sides. Russia wants Ukraine to cease to exist. Ukraine wants to survive. And there's not a lot of common ground between those two to actually reach any kind of compromise in these talks. But at the same time, they do provide a venue in which other things can be agreed, like the ongoing prisoner exchanges, for example. So they are not pointless, but they are a long way from something that is going to deliver an actual peace.
What other things, Keir, are you looking at that could be achieved?
There's really not a great deal that can be done between these two sides that are so implacably opposed. The headline that always comes out of these talks is the prisoner exchanges. If there are other things around the periphery of these talks that are actually being roughed out between the two sides, then we're not getting to hear about them.
So, Chris, what's your expectation? I mean, okay, out of these talks came a prisoner exchange. Will we ever witness a round of talks where we're going to see a ceasefire or an end to this war? Is that something that we can expect or hope for?
Wars end, and one has to believe that, even if, as Keir rightly says, these are implacable foes and the gaps between the parties are enormous and they're not shrinking at all. So at some point, I'm quite sure that we'll get to some form of, ceasefire. Maybe you'll get to a situation where several ceasefires, come and go and fail and break up. But I think what is necessary is to try to create the environment where the calculations for both sides, particularly Russia, changes. And that really depends on the position of European powers and the United States being more unified. I think that, there's been so many positions from the Trump administration over the last 7 months. It's all over the place. So you're never really quite sure whether Trump is prepared to put pressure on Putin or whether he's actually giving him a proverbial hug and adopting his views. At one moment, he's willing to supply Ukraine with weaponry, and another moment, he's not. So it does need that clarity between the EU and the US to demonstrate that they're united in trying to bring this to an end. They're prepared to put the pressure on Russia to introduce the sort of sanctions that Donald Trump has now actually said he wants to do. He has said that Putin has 50 days to respond. It can't all be pressure. There also has to be creative ways of trying to bridge those huge gaps. And we need to look at all the tools in the conflict resolution arsenal to try to bring this together, because this is going nowhere. We're seeing a very aggressive summer offensive by the Russians. It's just bringing destruction, suffering. and we have to bring this 3-year-old war to an end.
Shuai, there are a lot of gaps, as Chris said. I mean, on one side, with the Russians, you have Putin wanting to consolidate his battlefield gains with the 4 provinces. On the other side, you have Zelensky wanting to preserve the territorial integrity of Ukraine. A lot of distance between these two viewpoints on how the war should end diplomatically. Now, obviously, someone's got to compromise. Who's going to blink first, Shuai, and what will that mean for them domestically?
Yusuf, thank you. Yes, Chris was right. And these are the red lines that has been both sides clearly mentioned since the first talks after the war started in 2022. I think it is not easy to forecast that who will be the first blink, because the blink timing is also important, because when we first see that the Trump administration started to work, everyone seems to expect that the Zelensky and the Ukrainian side seems to be first side that give a much more positive message towards Russia to make the ceasefire or the peace talks. But the last 3 months changed everything. And in the battlefield also, there are major differences compared to the 1.5 year. Clearly, yes, the 4 provinces are under the control of Russia, but at the same time, that they also discussed in the 3rd round in Istanbul, there is some civilians issue that taken by the Kursk and other region has been basically targeted by the Ukraine side as well. So it is not easy to say which side would be the first to come to the common ground, but I think it's also important as an outcome to see from the 3rd round talks in Istanbul, there is a still willingness to continue the peace talks in Istanbul as well. And I think one and the biggest external dynamics within these peace talks, of course, the Trump's approach towards the Russia and the Ukraine as well. So we will see in which timing, in which sides, first ones to come to the more common ground is a still question mark.
Keir, when we take a look at these talks and take a step away from Russia and Ukraine, and we view this from the lens of Washington, London, Brussels, Paris, what type of support is there for these types of talks? Is this just going through the motions and just saying, okay, let's see where diplomacy can go, but not really a wholehearted supporter? Are Western capitals really wanting to see diplomacy prevail?
Well, we shouldn't forget that these talks have only started because of US pressure on Ukraine to essentially agree to Russia's terms. There was the question just a moment ago about who blinked first. It was the United States that blinked on behalf of Ukraine, and Ukraine that agreed to the unconditional ceasefire, which we shouldn't forget had been treated as the worst possible outcome for so long before that, essentially allowing Russia to pocket the gains, to cement the front line, to take a break from its grinding forward at immense cost of casualties, to rebuild its forces, all of the things that Ukraine was previously trying to resist, but now they've been forced into it by the United States. So this is very much a US-driven process, and the European powers, those that understand just how damaging this is for their own security, are far less proactive and far less enthusiastic in seeing these talks actually leading to some kind of unconditional ceasefire. That unconditional word being the most important, because the greatest fear is that this gives Russia the chance to regenerate its forces and launch its next attack at a time of its choosing.
Chris, have the Europeans kind of sidelined themselves over the past 3 years by not having any diplomatic channels open with the Russians? Because up till now, it's been military aid, military aid, military aid. But outside of really the Hungarian prime minister and maybe 1 or 2 very limited occasions, there's been no diplomacy between the Europeans and the Russians.
For me, I think that's unfortunate. I think that you need to explore all the possibilities. As much as I, consider that the Putin regime is absolutely despicable and it was an aggression on Ukraine that was completely unwarranted, for which there's no justification, I still think that you want to keep open these channels. You still want to work for the day that you may get a diplomatic success. Of course, there are going to be times when you really cannot do it. But Europe, I think, for too long has assumed that the United States would do all the heavy lifting. And then when you get a president who's not there to do the heavy lifting on these matters, Europe is all at sea and is confused, and there isn't a joint position. And they're all sort of rushing around wondering what to do in terms of European defense and security. So I think there does need to be a lot more work on how you really bring together a proper European-wide position that includes Britain as well as the EU, because Britain is a significant actor in all of this. And it's just too little, too late. And European foreign policy, I mean, it's really all over the place on so many issues, including Ukraine. And it's that need always for unanimity that lands up meaning that there is actually a very weak common position towards Ukraine, but also on matters of, say, the Middle East and elsewhere.
Shuai, outside of a venue, what do the Turks have to offer the diplomatic process? I mean, why are these talks taking place in Istanbul? Why are there Turkish mediators and not Saudi or Belarusian or another country?
I think especially the Russian-Ukrainian war, since the beginning of the first day, Turkey has been one of the only places they can hold the peace talks. First, Turkey right now is the only country who is the NATO member and also can still talk with the Russia in the leader level as well as in the different level. In the high-level perspective. Secondly, of course, Turkey has been supporting the territorial integrity of the Ukraine, and Turkey is an undeniable part of the European security architecture. But with this, the unique approach of Turkey towards both Ukraine and Russia in last 3 years within the wartime makes it more reliable partner compared to the other actors in the region to hosting the peace talks. And one more also, Minister Hakan Fidan mentioned in the last meeting and clearly say that Turkey is always ready to suggest more structured way of the peace talks that we've seen also in the grain deal agreement. So Turkey not only bring its own perspective, but also Turkey bringing the more multilateralism perspective to the peace talk if there will be an open floor for this.
Kira, I want a prediction from you. It's been 3.5 years now. Where are we in this war? Has this diplomacy now seen the end on the horizon, or is this protracted decade-long excursion that we're on right now?
Well, the Trump assumption was that if you bring sufficient pressure to bear on Ukraine to accede to what Russia is demanding, then the war can be brought to an end very quickly. But that, of course, overlooked the very simple and very basic fact that Ukraine wants to survive, wants to remain a sovereign, independent country, and will not submit to the terms that Russia is looking for. And that, of course, pulls the rug from any prospect of achieving peace on the terms that are currently being put forward. So all of the trends that we have in the war at the moment are things that were set months or years ago. For all of the headlines that came through, it's the same basic pattern to the war. Russia trying as hard as it can to destroy Ukrainian cities, to kill innocent civilians, to try to demoralize the population, while it pushes forward on a broad front very slowly at an enormous cost in casualties and damage to the Russian economy. All of those trends have been set, and all of them appear possible to continue for a long time to come, unless and until Ukraine finally concludes that enough pressure has been brought to bear on it by the United States through all of the levers that it has at its disposal, that it has to give some kind of more significant concession. And then Russia decides that the time is right to accept the gifts from the Trump administration and call a halt to the fighting. But those two factors seem still a long way off at this point.
So, Chris, while the Russians and Ukrainians were exchanging pleasantries Wednesday and Thursday, today, Friday, the Iran nuclear talks also kicked off in Istanbul. What's your expectation from these talks? Will we see some type of JCPOA 2.0, or is there some other final outcome that is being expected from the West, from the Iranians, the Israelis?
Well, these are talks between Britain, France, and Germany and the Iranians at Deputy Foreign Minister level. I think it is important because, of course, we've had this 12-day Israeli war in Iran that saw also the intervention of the United States in trying to take out Iranian nuclear facilities. So now you have to see what the diplomatic arena is going to be like after that war. Are we going to see a hardening of Iranian attitudes towards all of this? Or indeed, are we going to see a hardening of the US line, the European lines on all of this? There is a demand from the Europeans to see that Iran lets back the IAEA to look at the nuclear sites. They will also threaten the sanctions that were suspended will be snapped back at the end of August unless Iran concedes to some of these demands. But lurking in the background, and the Iranians feared this, and it's not denied by Israeli sources, that there could be another round of a war between Israel and Iran. I mean, we're not out of those woods yet. The tensions are still very high. And if the determination is that actually there are targets at Iranian nuclear facilities that still need to be bombed, it may well be that Netanyahu will continue to do it. He may even do it for his own political ends if he feels he needs a distraction from what is going on in Gaza, where a lot of pressure is now starting to be applied, and to bring Iran back into the equation. So it's very, very unclear. But I think it is, and on a positive note, it's good to see that the Europeans, these three leading European powers, are engaged on the issue, that they've woken up to realizing that they've got to take a lead, that they've got to try to get the Iranians and the Americans back into talks, which were, of course, suspended because of the Israeli aggression, and that they got to play an active role in it because it's very much in a European interest to see that there isn't going to be another Israeli-Iranian war. Because in many ways, we were very lucky last time around. The situation could have been 100 times worse. The war could have still been going on. We could have seen everything from nuclear fallout to a regional-wide war to a full blockade on all the hydrocarbon supplies that come out of the Gulf with the blockade of the Straits of Hormuz. So in some ways, we dodged the worst-case scenarios, and we're going to have to work really hard now, diplomatically, to make sure that we never get back there. And of course, ultimately, for those who do not want to see Iran having a nuclear weapon, there needs to be some hard work to make sure that that doesn't become a reality.
Mm-hmm. Shoaib, with the pause between Iran and Israel, it seems that Netanyahu's turned his gaze on Syria. I mean, now there's been about 800 strikes, I think, on Syrian soil with zero retaliation. Now, Syria is an area that the Turks are very, very invested in. Almost frozen relations between the Turks and the Israelis. Will the mediator need a mediator to talk with the Israelis to ensure that Syria remains peaceful, that Syria remains outside of this war? Because I'm assuming the Turks want stability over there. They want to see Syria rebuilt.
Thank you, Yusuf. That is one of the hardest questions you asked. First of all, I need to remind that a few weeks ago, the Minister Hakan Fidan clearly says that there is a direct stability and the territorial integrity in Syria is more than needed. And after the Syrian revolution in the 8th of the December, Israel unfortunately tried to strengthen and extend their Golan Heights process from the Israeli side, and as well as the last bombing of the Damascus. Basically, it is totally against not only the regional stability, but there is unfortunately high potential to bring the world to the both regional war and later on in the general extent the serious war in the global scale. In this respect, Turkey insisted to point it out that why the Syrian integrity and the stability is more important right now, because we all seen that the results of the Syrian civil war for 12 years, region right now cannot hold any big migration waves, and at the same time, right now the region has no capability to absorb any other tension within the Israel and the Syria already have the lots of attacks, and the tension has been going on through between Iran, Israel, and also the Palestine conflict over there.
Keir, do you think this ceasefire right now between Israel and Iran will hold? Is this something that you're confident in, or are both sides a little too trigger happy for it to remain stable?
Well, again, what we see here, and Chris alluded to this indirectly, is a gap between what the European powers that are involved in negotiations want and what the United States seems to want to achieve with its unconditional backing of Israel up to and including attacks on Iran. And those two positions, of course, have to come together for there to be any kind of real long-term solution of the kind that Chris was actually describing. I don't see at the moment that we are any closer to that, partly because, of course, of this US reluctance to rein in whatever it is that Israel actually wants to do. So the answer to your question, in short, is I don't know, but I agree with Chris that the situation is potentially dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Chris, a couple weeks ago, I was in Jordan. I had the opportunity to interview the former crown prince over there. I asked him, I said, why can't the Arabs just get together and solve their problems, give local solutions to local problems? And he said, yo, Yusuf, he's like, we've been basically fighting for 1,400 years since the prophet died, so it's nothing new. When you're looking at the region and you're looking at the local actors, do you want to see more responsibility, more accountability, and a bigger role coming from them?
Without question, I think that the local actors, not just the Arab states, by the way, really have to start working harder to resolve some of these issues and the tensions within the region. And some of it has happened in terms of there has been some degree of rapprochement, for example, between Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia and Iran. Whereas, if we were talking 10 years ago, we would have been talking about that long Cold War between Saudi and Iran. And whilst it's not sort of over, it's certainly far more manageable. But certainly, I think that they could do far better in coming with joint positions, creative solutions, active diplomacy as opposed to reactive, and always expecting the external powers to do the heavy lifting. But none of that also should be an excuse for the major powers of the world in terms of what they do, because they also have played a negative role at times, whether it's supplying weapons to one party in a conflict, failing to adhere to international law and to push for it to be upheld in all the courts and jurisdictions like the ICC and the ICJ. So I think that actually, given what we've seen in Syria, given the Iran-Israel war, given what's happening in Gaza, it's a collective failure that involves the region as well as the international powers. And we need to find far more constructive ways of bringing these very, very long-term conflicts and crises to an end, because our record on this is so poor.
Mm-hmm. Shuai, I want to ask you, with both of these issues, the Iran talks and the Ukraine peace talks, do you view Turkey as a neutral actor? Is it really neutral? Is it unbiased?
Thank you, Yusuf. Yes, I think so. And I think we are just talking that these last two cases. But if you look over the last 20 years, you can easily see that the different regional conflict that Turkey has been involved as a both mediator and the facilitator. For example, if you remember that in the first years of the 2000, Turkey even facilitate the dialogue between the Syria and the Israel at that time regarding the Golan Heights. Or if you look over the more contemporary case next to the Russia, Ukraine, and the Iran, we also have a very successful mediating process between the Somalia and the Ethiopia case in Africa. I think these different cases across the different regions clearly shows that Turkey has a important know-how in the mediating as well as the human resources, both in the ministry. And I think it also shows that Turkey is the reliable partner for different actors in terms of the security, in terms of the political dialogue, and in terms of the diplomacy. I think it's more important to add here, you know that it is my also personal expertise. The political leadership of the President Erdogan cannot be denied in this way, because his personal dialogue between the other leaders is a big contribution to the all mediation efforts in the Turkey, and he can clearly always open the dialogue with everyone in all conflictual areas to contribute to regional peace and the global peace as well.
Keir, 10, 15 years ago, these types of talks would have been exclusively handled at the United Nations, with the big five taking the lead. Now you're seeing more regional actors. You're seeing Saudi Arabia. You're seeing China trying to step up host talks or play an important role in diplomacy. Is the era of the big multilateral institution making way for these more dynamic minilaterals? Are we more in a multipolar world now, as we've been talking about for the past decade?
I don't think it is unheard of in previous decades that there would be mediating powers from the region instead of taking everything to the UN. But it is an indication of how limited the utility of the United Nations is in situations like this, when members of the P5 are actually the aggressors that need to have their wars mediated in. So in that respect, we shouldn't necessarily be surprised that these efforts are happening further around the world and not concentrated in what ought to have been the forum for resolving these issues.
Keir, Chris, Shuai, that's all the time we have. Thanks for sharing your analysis. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Yusuf Aram. If you got any comments, please share them with us on X at Straight Talk TRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find more exclusive content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.